psychedelic therapy is not mainly helping people by making them believe in a god or a divine ground of being or a cosmic consciousness. Sometimes it does that, and when it does, that might help them a bit, but the main driver of change, according to me, is that these experiences actually change how you see yourself. On a deep level, they change the representation, the model you have of the kind of person you are, and that can have a profound effect on all these things, on addiction, depression, anxiety.
Chris Letheby, welcome to the Range Project.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, Chris, you're a philosopher. You teach philosophy, and you're a researcher also in this area. And we're going to get into the specific area of research that you're focused on right now. But can you just give us a little bit of a background to your academic life and credentials, so to speak?
Sure. So I studied philosophy for 10 years at the University of Adelaide with a brief 6-month interlude in Lancaster in the UK. I'm from Adelaide. I did a bachelor's, master's and a PhD in philosophy, all at the University of Adelaide. And then about a year and a half after finishing my PhD, I got a job as a lecturer at the University of Western Australia. So I made the trek across the Nullarbor, and here I am nearly 6 years later.
Awesome. And we're very lucky to have you here in the West, actually.
Thank you.
So what drew you to philosophy in the first place? Because I'm a bit of a keen philosophy enthusiast myself. And I know
Sam teaches philosophy.
Yes.
I do, yeah.
Were you interested in it at school, or was it?
I was never really aware of it at school. I don't know when I first consciously became aware that philosophy existed and what it was, but I certainly seem to have had an interest in the big questions, in philosophical questions from fairly early on. And I became interested just through a chance read. I actually read a really kind of terrible classic New Age novel at around the age of 16, 17 that really got me interested in the whole idea of mysticism and meditation and altered states of consciousness, and the idea that there might be something like a meaning to life or a purpose to the universe. I mean, I had been raised Christian. I think my philosophical instincts kicked in, and I rejected that when I was around 10 or 11, and then was fairly sort of atheist, agnostic throughout my teen years. But then in my late teens, I became aware of the whole New Age world, and that led me to Buddhism. And I was just fascinated all along by this idea that there might be, as I say, something like a meaning to life, or a best way or a correct way to live, or some kind of purpose to it all. And for some reason, I became very persuaded by certain traditional forms of Buddhism, and I became a bit of a fundamentalist Buddhist for a while. I was a bit of a fanatical sort of classical Tibetan Buddhist when I was about 18, 19. And then again, my skeptical instincts sort of kicked in, and I ended up not going as far down that path as I had thought I was going to. And so then I was just left with these questions in a very acute form, right? Because I'd had this experience twice of believing fairly wholeheartedly in a religion that gives you a comprehensive story about what the universe is and how it works and what is the best way to use a human life. And so I felt that I no longer knew what the answers to these questions were, and they presented themselves as being very obvious and acute. I thought, my God, if what I need to do is not become a monk and meditate my entire life, then what do I need to do instead? What is the thing to do?
What were the indicators that drove you away from those, do you know?
Well, interestingly, they were philosophical. I mean, not solely, but one issue was that when I was involved in a very traditional form of Tibetan Buddhism, and Tibetan Buddhism has a lot of really rich philosophy and cosmology and a kind of tradition of debate and so on. And so there are elaborate metaphysical systems and epistemological systems and so on. And I'm sure I'd been exposed to it somewhere earlier on in passing. In fact, I definitely consumed like a lot of philosophically infused media, Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and stuff like that. But what really snagged me was the problem of free will and determinism, because there was this very elaborate sort of psychology in Buddhism about how every moment of mind and every decision is totally caused by all these previous moments of mind and so on. So a very sort of causal deterministic psychology, a more scientific looking psychology than you get in any other sort of pre-modern world religion as far as I know. And yet then there was also this emphasis on free will, this idea that anyone is free to choose to practice Buddhism and meditation and sort of break the bonds of karma and conditioning and so on. And I couldn't see the resolution to this apparent tension, this idea that, they're presenting the mind as this thoroughly deterministic causal system, and on the other hand telling you that you're free to choose to do something different no matter what has happened before. And nobody I pressed on this, including all the senior monks and so on, had an answer that I found satisfactory. So philosophy got me out of a monastic life, for which I'm forever grateful.
Okay, so you fast forward beyond the potential monastic life that you were going to have. What impact did some of the philosophy academics, your teachers at university, have on you? And were there some, teachers that just sort of blew your mind as far as just their method and how they introduced philosophy to you, whether it be Buddhist philosophy or any other approaches?
And I guess, could they answer those questions that you couldn't ask the monks?
Yeah, both really good questions, and these are questions that I don't think I've ever been asked on a podcast before. I always remember, I mean, it's hard to pick because I was taught by so many great philosophers and great teachers of philosophy who influenced me in various ways and had really strong kind of effects on my own development. I always think in this context of Chris Mortensen, who's now Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Adelaide, because when I was 21 in my first semester of first year, he seemed to me to be the archetypal image of a philosopher, this kind of white-bearded, wise old man who had been doing this for years, who was teaching me logic and critical thinking and introducing me to the Euthyphro dilemma and all these kinds of things. And I actually remember one specific moment when Professor Mortensen influenced me, and this is when I saw him look at an argument that someone had drawn up on a whiteboard and say, I don't buy it. I don't know what's wrong with it, but I don't buy it. And that sort of blew my mind as a budding young philosopher, because up until that point, I had sort of naively thought that if someone presents you with an argument in philosophy, either you have to be able to say what's wrong with it, or you have to accept the conclusion, These are the only options. If you can't say what's wrong with it, you've got to accept the conclusion. And so this sort of opened my mind to the idea that you can be a bit provisional and a bit uncertain, and there's room for there's room for instinct, I guess, and hunches in philosophical thinking. Even if these things can't directly justify a philosophical claim, they're not something that you have to totally shut out. Being a philosopher is not all about being a sort of hyper-rational logic robot, I suppose. Yeah, but so many others. I mean, I remember Jordi Fernandez, who's still teaching at Adelaide. It was his first semester teaching there, and he was a very kind of dynamic young lecturer teaching us about epistemology and sort of running all over the front of the lecture theatre and drawing little diagrams on the whiteboard and really kind of making the material come alive. That influenced me a lot. And then later in my studies, when I went from my bachelor's into my master's and PhD, I turned to cognitive science. I hadn't really been interested in this before, but I became interested in the philosophy of cognitive science and started to specialize in that. And then I was very fortunate to be taught by a trio of excellent philosophers, John Opie, Jared O'Brien, who was my PhD supervisor, and Philip Gerrans, who's been my longtime collaborator and co-author now. And they all just modeled really how to integrate philosophical methods with empirical findings, how to bring together the methods of philosophy with the findings of cognitive science and neuroscience and psychology and psychiatry to try and come up with a comprehensive, integrated understanding of the mind.
Did they work through things with you, or was it more of a lecture style, this is what philosophy is and this is what we know?
So, I mean, those three, of the three of them, John Opie was a lecturer of mine as an undergrad. So he taught me in several undergraduate courses, and he'd sort of begun to show me the attractions of a way of doing philosophy that was very closely integrated with science and that drew on scientific findings. O'Brien and Gerrans taught me very little in that sort of formal sense, but they both supervised me to some extent as a postgraduate. So Philip Gerrans was my secondary supervisor when I did my master's. Jared O'Brien was my principal supervisor for my PhD. And so in that capacity, they would sort of read my work and give me feedback and model for me, how to be a philosopher and how to do philosophy, and also how to survive in the academic world, which is a completely different but also very necessary set of skills.
So can you tell us a little bit about how cognitive science and philosophy converge? And maybe for those people out there that don't know what cognitive science is in the first place, just a little bit of an explainer?
Yeah, sure. So cognitive science, it's standardly said now, started to form in the 1950s and was really defined in the 1970s, or maybe from the 60s through to the 70s, people started to explicitly conceive of the idea that there was such a thing as cognitive science. And it was classically defined as a multidisciplinary attempt to understand the mind on the model of a computer. So an attempt by academics from multiple disciplines to study and understand and explain the workings of the human mind by adopting the hypothesis or the assumption that the mind is a computing system, a computational system of some kind. And traditionally, cognitive science was defined as involving contributions from 6 disciplines: philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, linguistics, artificial intelligence, and computer science. And so computer science has at its core, of course, the very idea of a computing system, and so that provides a sort of theoretical foundation. And then there were supposed to be various kind of argumentative, analytical, experimental, theoretical contributions from all these disciplines. Linguists studying how humans acquire language, and neuroscientists doing brain scans, and philosophers kind of arguing about what exactly a computational system is and what it means to say that the mind is a computational system, and everyone sort of contributing. And so obviously you have bits of psychology that are not cognitive science, and you have bits of philosophy that are not cognitive science, but the idea is that cognitive science was this kind of effort by academics from all these different disciplines to try and understand the mind based on this, what's called the computational theory of mind, the theory that the mind is a computer of some sort.
So as a cognitive scientist, someone who kind of gathers a whole bunch of different disciplines together to try and figure out what they all know and what the common ground is and find some area between the boundaries?
Not so much, no. A cognitive scientist, so it's kind of a bit down to personal preference and maybe institutional requirements and whatever, whether someone actually calls themselves a cognitive scientist or not. But usually someone who is known as a cognitive scientist will have a primary training in one of these disciplines. So they will be primarily a psychologist or a philosopher or something like this. It's very usual to also have a serious training in one or two of the others, or at least a pretty good working familiarity with some of the others.
And do you do a lot of work between all those people as well?
Yeah, there is a lot of collaborative work, to be sure. Yeah, I think that's the nature of the beast.
So can you give us some concrete examples? Because there's a lot of layers to this, right? And there's a lot, integrating all of these disciplines together. Can you give us a concrete example of how that's done, or one of the outcomes, let's say, from an area of investigation for a cognitive?
So a classic example is you think back to the 1970s, because nowadays this traditional definition of cognitive science, it's not quite so clear exactly how and where it applies, because things have become a lot more complicated. The landscape has changed since then. But you think back to the 1970s, there are people in AI like Roger Schank, I think he was at Yale, writing these programs that are supposed to simulate human language understanding, the human ability to comprehend stories. And so Schank is doing what is effectively computer science. He's writing programs, and these are programs that you feed a story into, and then you ask it questions about the story, and it's supposed to give you sensible answers. It's supposed to be able to read between the lines. So there's contributions going in there from computer science, but that sort of work is also going to be influenced by findings from linguistics and experimental psychology about what exactly humans do when they understand stories, and what kinds of responses we're able to give, what patterns there are in our responses, and those sort of data are going to constrain the performance that the program then has to exhibit. So that's one way that findings from different disciplines can converge. You can try and explain or model some cognitive capacity that humans have by writing a program that can then kind of display that competence or capacity itself. And of course today we might think of things like ChatGPT, large language models that certainly can simulate or emulate a lot of our conversational capacities very impressively, but they are not being built, at least in in the first instance primarily as cognitive models, right? They're not attempts to model what goes on in our minds when we have conversations. And if they were, we would be looking at them asking not only can they do what we want them to do, but also do they match the findings from linguistics, from experimental psychology and so on, and indeed from neuroscience about how we do these things and the performance we exhibit and the sort of patterns of errors and successes that we exhibit when we do these things.
So now that we've got a somewhat of a handle of cognitive science and philosophy and
full bottle,
can we now sort of fast forward to the current research that you're doing and the research you've been doing over the past several years now, because it's super exciting to me. I think it's worth explaining this in terms of these controlled scenarios. So can you kind of clarify the sort of context in which you're observing on a philosophical level these experiences of people?
Sure, yeah. So you're right. There's a lot of important distinctions to make. And the first distinction is between intentional, careful, safe psychedelic use in controlled settings, and on the other hand, psychedelic use in the wild, if you like, in uncontrolled settings. And so these drugs have been subjects of a lot of controversy over the years, and not without reason. They do have risks, but we know by now that if you're careful in controlled settings, those risks can be managed acceptably. You know, if you kind of give them, I mean, in traditional contexts, in indigenous cultures, they're always given in a very structured ceremonial setting. But I've engaged most with the sort of clinical research that's been happening in the last 30 years. And so there you're taking a lot of care. You're kind of screening your participants very carefully. And, you know, anyone with a personal history or an immediate family history of any kind of psychotic mental illness is excluded, right, on the grounds that that is a risk factor. That's when you really can potentially get things like lasting psychotic reactions being triggered when there is some predisposition to it. And then people are getting very carefully prepared, right? They're having thorough psychiatric and medical screenings. Physically, these drugs are actually very safe. You know, every kind of pharmacologist who knows their stuff will tell you that they're physically among the safest drugs we know of. If you have any conditions relating to the heart or high blood pressure or whatever, they should be avoided. They can kind of raise heart rate and blood pressure, and so they're not totally risk-free, but physically they're extremely safe. The risks are all psychological, more or less. And then those also seem to have a lot to do with having some kind of predisposition to some sort of psychotic condition. So the track record of the research over the last 30 years shows that if you screen people carefully, prepare people carefully, and give, you know, they can be quite serious doses still, moderate to high doses in controlled environments where you've got a couple of therapists or other professionals present to give support and reassurance, then people can still have kind of experiences that get a bit frightening at times, or even quite frightening, but it can be managed. You have interpersonal support, reassurance, and there doesn't seem to be any lasting harm really ever when those sorts of precautions are taken. So that's the sort of use that I'm interested in philosophically. And yeah, I mean, we can dig into aspects of it in more detail, but in essence, psychiatrists, scientists have been for, you know, the last 20 or 30 years doing clinical trials using these drugs as adjuncts to therapy for depression, for anxiety, for addiction, and getting really impressive results, what seem to be far better results than with conventional treatments. And as a philosopher, this interests me in a lot of ways, right? I'm interested in what we can learn about the mind from it, from a sort of cognitive science angle, but I'm also deeply intrigued by the fact that people attribute the change when they do have these dramatic and lasting reductions in depression, anxiety, and addiction, and so on. They almost invariably attribute that change to the experience itself. They say it's not like the drug acting on me like an antidepressant. It's this substance actually enabled me to have some kind of experience, and the experience helped me to change. And moreover, they will say, I learned things from this experience, right? I underwent a drug-induced altered state of consciousness, which taught me deep and profound and important things about myself and the universe. And these things that I learned helped me to recover from my psychiatric condition. So philosophically, these are really provocative claims, and I'm really interested in them.
So what does it mean to study metaphysically the content of one of these patients' experiences? I mean, how do you gather data? Are we talking a video recording of their observations of what they're going through, or are you interviewing them post the experience? How does that? What kind of data are you looking at?
Yeah, so I'm personally not doing any kind of empirical research. I'm not studying anyone. I'm not interviewing anyone. I'm just like an intellectual parasite sitting in my philosopher's armchair, reading all the research everyone else has been doing and then trying to come up with theories. Just like I was saying about my mate Phil Gerrans, read all the molecular psychiatry and all the neuroimaging and use your philosopher's tools of analysis and conceptual clarification and come up with a big overarching theory about what's going on that then can kind of feed back and stimulate more experimental research.
So what's your big theory?
Let's
get started. Well, that's in a book actually, Steve. Which,
it is in a book.
I think it's a good time to plug that, by the way.
Excellent. Sales pitch. Philosophy of Psychedelics, out 2021 from Oxford University Press, available in some good bookstores, maybe. I've seen it in a bookstore once or twice. It was a pretty nice moment. Yeah. But you can buy it online for a reasonable sort of price, about $50 or so. It's, not too bad for an academic book. They slug you hundreds for those sometimes.
So I guess what is, if you could boil it down, the unified theory of that book, or the thesis, I guess.
Yeah, so the thesis really is that
spoiler alert. By the way.
It is. There are two basic claims, and one is that people really do learn things from psychedelic experiences, not necessarily all the things that they always think they do, but in the philosophical jargon, there are real and substantial, significant epistemic benefits of psychedelic experience. So epistemic just means knowledge relating to knowledge. And the other claim is that psychedelic therapy works mainly by changing the brain's models of the self, right? So there are other views about how it works. Some people think actually it's not really the experience doing the work at all. Most of the work is being done at a purely low level, sort of physiological level, changing the wiring of brain cells, and the experience is just fireworks. It's just a sideshow. And so those people actually want to engineer molecular variants of psychedelics that can kind of do that without the nasty, annoying trip, which I don't think is actually a terrible idea, but I don't think it's going to work completely. And then there are other theories that the main thing doing the work is actually people having new beliefs about the ultimate nature of reality, because sometimes the kinds of experiences people have, especially the type of, it all gets very kind of complicated, but in some of these experiences, people seem to discover some deep truth about the nature of reality. They have these so-called mystical experiences, and they come away believing, when maybe they didn't before, that reality is kind of constituted entirely by consciousness, that there's something like a cosmic consciousness or a universal mind or a divine ground of being and things like this. And so there is an idea that maybe it's these kinds of beliefs. These beliefs are perhaps comforting, psychologically reassuring. So you get the author Michael Pollan, the American journalist and author, back before he wrote his big book on psychedelics. He has his book How to Change Your Mind from 2018 on psychedelics, but a few years earlier he had a piece in the New Yorker where he was looking at psychedelic therapy for anxiety and depression in terminal illness. So psychedelics being given to people with a terminal diagnosis, not to treat the condition itself, but to help them overcome their grief and existential distress about their condition. And so the way Pollan put it was, is psychedelic therapy simply foisting a comforting delusion on the sick and dying? Is it helping them is it cheering them up by making them believe in a great metaphysical beyond, which may actually just be a hallucination? And so that question is really the one that I try and address in the book. And what I say is, no, psychedelic therapy is not mainly helping people by making them believe in a God or a divine ground of being or a cosmic consciousness. Sometimes it does that, and when it does, that might help them a bit, but the main driver of change, according to me, is that these experiences actually change how you see yourself. On a deep level, they change the representation, the model you have of the kind of person you are, and that can have a profound effect on all these things, on addiction, depression, anxiety.
Okay, I'll just save myself $50.
Yeah, but there's a whole nice reference list at the end.
So is there anything we should be worried about with these kind of studies that are being done? And I've read recently about this move from big pharma into this area, into this drug development area, this burgeoning space, because they're getting so many successes with these therapeutic benefits. Is there anything you think we should be worried about in that regard, or?
Oh, look,
I'm sure there are.
There probably is. I personally don't feel that qualified to comment on those kind of political, economic type issues. I mean, I will say there have been some interesting things going on wherein for-profit companies have attempted to patent some of the really basic elements of psychedelic therapy, you know, like let's get a patent for having two people with you while you take the drug. That's a kind of trademark aspect of the process that we came up with, and apparently this is something they do. They just kind of put in these patent applications containing all sorts of outrageous stuff just to see what will stick.
Right.
It's not an area I know a lot about, but the impression I get is there probably is a bit that's worth worrying about there. There are other things too. I mean, first of all, as I say, the evidence so far, and it is pretty overwhelming, is that this can be done really safely in controlled conditions, but there are still things we don't understand, right? There still is this phenomenon of hallucinogen persisting perception disorder or flashbacks. You get a few people reporting that, a good few people out in the wild. There haven't been reports of it yet in clinical trials, but like we don't really know yet what the difference is, what it might be about doing psychedelics in the wild versus a controlled setting that protects against that. And so that means we don't really know for sure that that won't start happening if this becomes approved as a medicine and gets scaled up. What else? I mean, one thing that's worth worrying about is just how much it's actually going to cost, supposing it is everything that it promises to be and gets approved. And I mean, the Australian Therapeutic Goods Administration actually did last year approve psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression and MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. It's still quite hard, you know, they can only be used by licensed psychiatrists and there has to be an approvals process.
Do you get involved in the PTSI stuff at all?
PTSD?
PTSD, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't personally.
That's what we got.
We call it a parent-teacher-student interview.
Yeah. That's all these acronyms just stuck in my head. PTSD, sorry.
I'm sure there's no connection.
We have to talk to you about your son.
Right. Yeah, no, because I mean, all the research so far, or all the stuff that's been published for PTSD has been with MDMA, which is a drug that is not technically a psychedelic. It's related to psychedelics. It's kind of similar in some ways.
I imagine there'd be some philosophical discussions about its use there as well.
Yeah.
Are people doing your job in that area as well?
Well, look, one or two, yeah. There's a guy called Brian Earp who wrote a book called Love Drugs, which is really, it's more of a sort of ethical slant, but it is about, you know, what could it mean to have drugs that could create love, which is what people say that MDMA can do, and what ethical issues would that raise. I actually supervised an honours project a few years ago at UWA. A student named Aidan Howard wrote a thesis on the philosophy of MDMA, looking at some of the same issues I do in relation to psychedelics. You know, do people learn things from these experiences in therapeutic contexts? Are there epistemic benefits, and if so, what might they be? So there's definitely work to be done there. Yeah, I just haven't really touched it myself.
All right, so I actually want to pivot onto your teaching, the teaching side of your job.
Sure.
We focused a bit on your research, and but you're also teaching a multitude of different philosophy courses at UWA right now. And we're always interested in drawing lessons as far as teaching and learning is concerned, and how we can draw those lessons and maybe recreate that kind of thing here at Scotch, and how you know we can get this cross-pollination going on from the world of university world and the high school world and that kind of thing. So can you give us a bit of a sense about what you're teaching right now at UWA?
Right, yeah. So at the present moment, I am teaching one unit, which is formal logic. It's a second year course. It has this real clickbaity name that I didn't come up with. It's called Logic, How to Defeat Your Foes with Reasoning. And at first I thought...
So adversarial right from the start.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah. Adversarial, misleading, clickbaity, as I say, just shameless marketing. It's terrible. And initially I thought, this is so bad, I have to get rid of it. And then I realized I like creating these nice unit guides, right? This detailed syllabus document that I give the students that tells them everything about the course, you know, when classes are, how to approach it, what they need to do well, and stuff like this. And I sort of take some pride in the aesthetics of these documents, and I like to get some, you know, free clip art to put on the front. So I find clip art that sort of thematically matches the title or the topic of the unit.
You can get ChatGPT to generate that now, can't you? Or at
true.
Least, yeah.
But then I couldn't,
DALL-E or one of these tools.
But I couldn't look my students in the eye and tell them not to use ChatGPT to write their essays if I did that. But I was really pleased when I realized one day that I could get a clip art of a hand doing the Vulcan salute from Star Trek and a little clip art of two people sword fighting, like an icon type thing, you know what I mean? These abstract sort of shapes. So one icon clip art of the Vulcan salute and one of two people sword fighting, and then it's like logic, how to defeat your foes. And I was so taken with this that I thought, I have to keep the title. I have to keep the clickbaity title. So yeah, that's the one I'm doing at the moment. Last semester I did.
So you're a Trekkie back in the day?
I'm a Trekkie from way back. Yeah. And this probably says something about me.
What was the best generation?
Well, I've got to admit, I don't think I ever would have thought this as a kid, but as an adult, I am one of these people who says Deep Space Nine is the best.
Okay.
I think that is the pinnacle of the franchise. In some ways, it is less Trek than some of the earlier ones.
I kind of stopped after the Next Generation.
Yeah,
Picard,
okay.
but I might get back and try Deep Space Nine.
Picard's your guy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Picard's great. Yeah. He's got to be the best captain,
Data.
probably. Yeah. But I wanted to be Spock as a kid. I mean, this probably says something about me and how I came to end up teaching logic in the philosophy department.
Yeah, that's why I asked the
UWA.
question, actually, because it's, Spock and all those guys. That was the Vulcan. That was mainly what they were known for, right?
Logic. They
Logic,
are creatures of logic.
Yeah.
And so not only was I the nerdy kid who would watch Star Trek, but I was the kid who would watch Star Trek and want to be Spock. Like, I didn't want to be Captain Kirk, beating up aliens and getting the girls. I wanted to be Spock, being totally logical.
Can I ask you this? So I'm assuming you're a big sci-fi fan in general.
Not reasonably. Like, I mean, I've got some big holes in my sci-fi education, but I like sci-fi. Yeah.
Are you a little excited about Dune Part 2? Have you had a chance to see that at the cinema yet?
I haven't. I want to. I'll tell you what I'm more excited about, and that's Three Body Problem on Netflix.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's worth
I'll
a
watch
look.
that.
I haven't seen it yet. Have you guys read the books?
No.
Do you know about them?
No.
So check it out. Cixin Liu. It's a trilogy. This is like the foremost contemporary Chinese sci-fi author. Now, this book comes recommended by Barack Obama, George R.R. Martin, and Chris Letheby. So, I don't know what more you want, frankly. I honestly, it took me back to being a kid reading sci-fi.
What was it called again? Sorry?
The Three Body Problem.
Okay.
So the trilogy, the actual name of the trilogy officially is Remembrance of Earth's Past, but they just refer to it as the Three Body Trilogy. So the first novel is the Three Body Problem. But it really, I don't know if you guys remember, like, being a kid reading sci-fi or fantasy or whatever it was that got you going, and just being so gripped and needing so badly to find out what was going to happen next that you would read the novel while you were walking from place to place. That level of, it was the first thing to do that to me in years.
Right.
I remember, like, just sitting at this little Chinese joint on the way to my friend's place for a party and just, like, avidly reading the second novel, getting towards the end, because it was so.
Okay.
I do remember doing that, but it has been years since I've done that.
Well, you're on long service leave. You've got absolutely no excuse now to not read.
Plenty of excuses. I make excuses every day.
So, well, speaking of science fiction, I guess, you also teach a course on the philosophy of AI at UWA.
I do at the moment,
Yeah.
mainly because my colleague Klaus Weber, who invented it, is doing a research project. So when he comes back, we might have to fight over it.
So,
have you had any annoying students in the class?
Never. They've all been wonderful. Some more wonderful than others.
As far as your teaching is concerned, in terms of how you conceptualize teaching a course like that, I'm wondering, are there some common themes or approaches that you use across all the different types of philosophy courses that you teach, in terms of, distilling down concepts and arguments at the end of each week into a sort of concise deductive or inductive argument? Is that an approach you saw other philosophy teachers teach to you, and that you have now adopted, or is that sort of an approach that is somewhat unique to you?
No, so I have been influenced by people in this. So when we start learning philosophy, we often tend to get taught syllogistic logic. So the kind of logic that goes back to Aristotle of formalizing these arguments. So a syllogism, is just an argument, any argument that has two premises and a conclusion. And Aristotle catalogued all these different types of syllogisms, the valid ones and the invalid ones. And they're very, the classic example that you give intro logic students is all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. What you've got is two premises and a conclusion that they are supposed to entail, and the options are either you accept the conclusion, you reject one or both of the premises, or you reject the idea that the premises entail the conclusion. If I say, hey, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, your options pretty much are accept that Socrates is mortal, reject one or the other of the premises, all men are mortal or Socrates is a man, or try and show somehow that you can accept those premises and reject the conclusion. Try and show that the one doesn't follow from the other. And minus a couple of wrinkles, that's pretty much the landscape of options. And then, of course, each one of those options might have many different permutations and variations, but I think that can really help to kind of focus your mind and help you keep track of where you are in logical space, as we like to say. And I do remember there are two people I can think of who sort of reminded me of the value of this kind of approach as I was, after I'd been studying philosophy for a while and then I was getting into actually teaching as a full-time lecturer. One was a Norwegian philosopher who also works on issues to do with psychedelics, Ole Martin Moen. And I went to a conference where he was giving a talk, and normally you go to academic conferences and people stand up and they've got their PowerPoint, 20 or 30 slides, whatever, they talk through it. I went to this conference and this guy was giving a talk and he was talking about very much the same issues I'm interested in. Do psychedelics give people false beliefs, and are they bad for this reason? And I walked into his talk and all he had was this easel set up the front with butcher's paper on it, and on it he had written, 1, psychedelics are distorting. 2, things that are distorting are bad. Therefore, 3, psychedelics are bad, right? And this was not an argument that he bought, but he was saying, look, this is the argument that people make, right? This is the argument whether they set it out like this or not. They're saying these things distort your mind, things that distort your mind are bad, so these things are bad. So if you want to counter this argument, if you want to reject the premise that psychedelics are bad, these are pretty much your options. And the simplicity and the clarity of it just blew my mind. And I thought, okay, yeah, this is a really effective kind of intellectual and pedagogical tool, the good old-fashioned syllogism. And then I have a colleague at UWA, one of our sort of best teachers in the department, Dr. Michael Rubin, who also uses this sort of thing a lot in his teaching, just really distilling this kind of complex philosophical problem down to, a syllogism, or here's 3 propositions. They all seem plausible, but they can't all be true, so we have to pick which one we're going to reject, or something like that.
I feel like you would have had syllogism of the month or something when you were working there.
Yeah. Maybe we should start a competition.
Yeah. So do you think you can distill most complex issues into a syllogism?
I'm going to say most philosophical problems, not all. Sometimes it really seems like the argument has to have 3 premises instead of 2, and that upsets me when it happens. But yeah,
what about the paradoxes? How do syllogisms deal with paradoxical claims?
Yeah, good question. So let me think of an example. I haven't personally made a deep study of paradoxes. The most famous one is the liar paradox, right? This sentence is false. If anyone hasn't come across it, you just sort of think about it for a minute, right? So it's this self-referential sentence. It says this sentence is false, and the idea is, well, if it's false, then it has to be true because what it's saying is correct. And if it's true, then it has to be false because what it's saying is incorrect. So that's one of the classic paradoxes. Could you fit that into a syllogistic structure? You could, right? So you could say something like this. If the liar sentence is true, then it is also false. First premise. If the liar sentence is false, then it is also true. Second premise. Therefore, conclusion, the liar sentence is both true and false. Now, maybe that's unsatisfactory because I actually left a premise out, which is the premise that says either the liar sentence is true or the liar sentence is false. You need that to make the argument valid. So sometimes you think, yeah, maybe the syllogism approach doesn't quite nail it. But still, I think most interesting philosophical problems, obviously you sacrifice some detail, but their essence can be articulated in a simple argument with just sort of 2 or 3 premises. Yeah.
Okay, so I'd love to just talk a little bit more about the philosophy of AI and that course you teach, because I'm super interested in it, and a lot of our students here at Scotch are super interested in it. What have been the most convincing arguments that you've heard with regards to this notion of the singularity, this idea that sort of AI is going to hit this sort of explosive, it's like a runaway train as far as intelligence, and it's going to far surpass human beings into almost like a super intelligence, and that's going to have these profound implications for, mankind.
Yeah, well, so you've got this argument for the conclusion that there is going to be a singularity, a runaway intelligence explosion that goes back to the statistician I.J. Good in the 1960s, and then it's sort of been resurrected and discussed since then by a few other people, but it gets given this really rigorous treatment by the philosopher Dave Chalmers, and we studied the paper. You can probably remember the argument at least as well as I can. Maybe just correct me if I go wrong. It's been a few months since we finished the unit. But basically, it relies on the premise that we are going to be able to create machines that are more intelligent than we are, even by the tiniest little bit. And the idea is, well, machines that are more intelligent than we are, by definition, are going to be better than we are at intellectual tasks, including the design of machines. So they're going to be better than we are at designing machines because we designed them. That means they're going to be able to design something better than them. And then that basic principle just iterates, right? The idea is that every time a machine can design something better than itself, then that thing is going to be better than it at designing machines, so that's going to be able to design something better than itself, and you can set this out. In fact, I think Chalmers sets this out. I think he sets it out first in a syllogistic form, and then he does like a 3-premise version, but it's sort of like, premise 1, there will be AI, right? So an artificial system that is at least as intelligent as humans. And then he says, if there is AI, then there will be AI plus, in other words, artificial intelligence that's more intelligent than humans. If we can get to building something that's as smart as we are, we or it can probably build something smarter. And then there's this third claim, if there's AI plus, AI that's more intelligent than we are, then there's going to be AI that's way more intelligent than we are. And that is basically the singularity, as Chalmers understands it, this runaway intelligence explosion caused by the continual construction or the repeated construction of machines that are better at building machines than their creators were.
Okay, to hark back to your great philosophy teacher in Adelaide that you mentioned, do you buy it?
You don't buy it.
Do you buy it?
I thought you were going to say you didn't buy it. Do you buy it?
I don't buy it, but I can't quite articulate why.
That's the thing. You're allowed to say that, it turns out.
And I could. We'll have a discussion after this because I might look like an idiot. But we had a discussion about this, and it was, I don't know if I can. Anyway, I don't think we can quite hit a singularity if we come from something that has got this defined origin.
Interesting.
Because we don't know where we came from, and
we've got a halfway decent idea.
In certain, in some respect, but you can always, cancel us down to smaller and smaller components and to a history that is undefinable. But when you start, AI started here, and we're always trying to reach this kind of like, it's almost like an asymptote. Like it will never reach singularity because it didn't start from an infinitely small beginning.
I mean, it partly depends how you define the singularity, right? So the way Chalmers defines it, it doesn't have to be an infinite intelligence explosion. It's just a runaway intelligence explosion that is
smarter
basically
than humans.
Well, and smarter enough that that they are. You would consider them super intelligent, smarter than we are by
what? Like the AI can be smarter than us in certain areas or certain systems.
Yeah,
but it's not. I don't think it can ever be smarter than us in everything that we do.
Yeah, I mean, so that is one of the important issues, and that's one of the objections people raise to the argument. They say, well, first of all, is there really such a thing as intelligence per se, general intelligence that can meaningfully be compared across species? Chalmers has a nice response to this. He just says, look, there doesn't actually have to be. You can sort of fix the argument to get around those issues by just saying, look, first of all, there's going to be this runaway explosion in the capacity to build machines that can do lots of stuff. And secondly, that capacity, the capacity to build machines that can do lots of stuff, is plausibly correlated with other capacities which make this an interesting event, right? Like the capacity to benefit or harm us in really significant ways. So, yeah, it's a worry, but it's not necessarily fatal.
Yeah, but I see it as a tool. I see like a calculator as a tool, and a computer and a phone and whatever else is a tool, and they get more and more complex. And I guess our skill level compared to what they used to be may diminish as well. So if we're talking about a singularity as far as that goes, the more complex or more capable the tool is, the less we have to rely on ourselves to solve a problem.
Yeah, I mean, there is a real question, though, about whether if we were to create something as intelligent as humans by some metric, it would be correct or appropriate to continue to consider it a tool, right?
Anyway.
That could be for another couple of hours, I think.
We could go on for a while. I mean, we had some great conversations about, and this is, again, I think this is the real virtue of that sort of syllogistic deductive approach, is Chalmers takes this argument, this somewhat informal argument that this statistician has made, and said, look, here's how you can understand this. This is the first premise. This is the second premise. This is the third premise. This is the conclusion. It gives you a structure to work to, and he says explicitly that this is part of what he's trying to do, that, to kind of put the challenge to people who don't think there's going to be a singularity, to say, well, which bit do you reject? Which premise don't you buy into? Or is it the inference? Because it's got to be one of those. Or you can say, I don't buy it, but I don't know why. But Chalmers is trying to stop you doing that.
But it's almost an exploratory tool.
I think so, yeah. It gives you a map of logical space, and then you can figure out where you sit, even if that kind of is changing and you're wavering a bit. You can sort of see where you are.
Where do your intuitions lie, in a way?
Yeah.
All right, I think we're going to get to wrap it up here. We got a few quick-fire questions, which we always have at the end of our Range Project episodes.
Oh, I wasn't warned about this.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Should have watched more episodes.
That's true. That's true. Let that be a lesson to me.
I was going to start with our first one, Deserted Island, favourite album, but I thought maybe Deserted Island, favourite syllogism?
I am on a deserted island.
You can go album. You can go
Or
album
both.
if you like, because I think that's a bit rough.
Oh, I was gonna have real fun with that. I was gonna come up with something about, I'm on a deserted island. All people on deserted islands are alone, therefore I'm alone, or something like that. Oh God, that is actually, and I've thought a lot about this question, favorite album, desert island album, that sort of thing. Where my mind immediately went was The Kick Inside by Kate Bush. So I'm going to go with that.
Kate Bush.
I wouldn't be mad if I were on a desert island and that was the one that I had.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Just armed with the syllogisms and the Kate Bush
Syllogism
album.
and Kate Bush, I'll be right.
Okay, which philosophers first caught your attention? Was it the early Greeks or the more, recent or modern logic chopping masters like Wittgenstein? Like which philosophers drew you in first?
Well, if we're going to be honest, it was the Buddhists. It was the ancient Indians. I mean, that's what I was learning before I ever set foot in a university, going to my kind of Buddhist classes in Adelaide and then my Buddhist retreat in Nepal. We were studying, Tibetan philosophers like Tsongkhapa, Indian philosophers like Nagarjuna, all these kind of great intellectual giants in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition that came out of India and into Tibet. Then, when I actually started studying philosophy formally at university, I've got to admit I was more drawn to the logic choppers. Like, we didn't study a lot of ancient philosophy. We did like a little bit of Plato here and there and things like this. And obviously I found it interesting, but I definitely, as a professional philosopher, have not read nearly as much Plato as I should have. I just was really kind of gripped by the somewhat contemporary, the 20th century debates and all this kind of, modern philosophy of mind, the mind-body problem, debates with Quine and people like this about the relation of philosophy and science, naturalism, scientific method, debates over the nature of logic and things like this. And I was really interested in meta-ethics as well, and so reading a lot of the kind of 20th century meta-ethics stuff about the nature of moral claims and so on. So yeah, I'm definitely one of those kind of ahistorical, historically under-informed analytic philosophers, I'm afraid. But I have tried to make up for it by not being a pure armchair analytic philosopher, and at least getting my hands dirty with science a bit, even if I haven't gone as much into the history of philosophy as I really should have.
Great. Okay. And what book or books have had the most profound effect on you? And which would you recommend most? Doesn't necessarily have to be in philosophy, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're very different questions, right? Because the one book that had the biggest effect on me, I definitely would not recommend, and that was The Celestine Prophecy by James Redfield. So this is this absolute kind of new age classic. This really terrible.
I remember when that came out. It was hugely popular.
Yeah, the early 90s. Yeah. And I sort of came across it by chance in the early 2000s, and that was the thing that kind of got me into this whole new age spirituality, and then led me to Buddhism, which then led me to philosophy. So that had a massive effect on me. Recommendation: Middlemarch. I've been reading Middlemarch once a year for 10 years. I'm about to start my 11th annual Middlemarch read, so I don't know if I need to say much more than that.
Okay. And finally, last one, what habit have you formed in the last 5 years that's been most beneficial to you?
Daily walks.
Daily walks.
Daily
Awesome.
walks. It's boring. It's simple. It's true.
Was that Immanuel Kant was a daily walker, wasn't he? Maybe you could set your watch to his walks.
Set your watch to his walks. Yeah, I'm not quite that rigid, but yeah, it's a pretty reliable schedule. Chris
Letheby, thank you for joining us here at Scotch College, and thank you for joining us on the Range Project. It was awesome.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Chris.